What if you considered human and social capital in your holistic legacy planning? Good morning. I'd like to welcome Aaron Shelley to this Friday's Designing Your Legacy podcast episode. He looks at how the worlds of family and business systems merge. He has a degree in engineering, which he'll speak about more in a moment, as well as an MBA. Welcome, Aaron.
Thanks, Angelina. Very excited to be here.
Thank you. And I believe you're joining us from the lovely state of Utah today.
Yes, I am.
Yes. So let's dive deep into some of the problems that you've seen out there, because I think this is the area that we need to tackle because it's the pink elephant in the room. And you've also recently released a book, which I'm sure you'll hold up in a moment to share. But let's talk about the problems first, the divorce rates. Maybe you should just lead us.
All right. Yeah. So if you look at the divorce rate, so I like to look at things from business and family. So I'm going to kind of jump between business and family. I think a lot of people understand business more than they do family dynamics right now. And we've studied it, millions of dollars. We've often gone to school for it. So I'm just going to look at the context. So if you look at a divorce from a business side, it would essentially be where two founders came together, couldn't figure out how to make the business work, and then separated. So if you look at what's happening in our families, I think it's very similar. Two people came together. They couldn't figure out how to work together, what they brought to the table. Maybe they came to the table with, I'm an engineer and you're an engineer and let's start a company. Then you run into problems like, well, who's going to do marketing and who's going to run the business and accounting, right? So if you're looking for people that overlap your skill set and are just like you, it doesn't make for a very efficient business, nor does it make for a very efficient family. And you can't appreciate the other person's skills as much. So I think what we've seen is this recent push really, where people are trying to do the same jobs. Like, I want to make the money in the family and you want to make the money in the family. Well, who's going to do the investing in the family? Who's going to have children? Who's going to raise them? And there's not specific roles that a woman or a man has to do. It's really just around how are we going to do that together?
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think you've also talked about the culture. Just as a company has a culture, every family unit has a culture, and every family business even has a culture. And we'll speak into family businesses in a moment. And I think you've also looked out into the baseline and thought to yourself, how do we prepare the next gen if the teaching skills aren't necessarily there on the part of the parents because they're working two jobs, or they're consumed with building the business because we're living in this culture now that almost glorifies money as a false idol, or money as something that's been propped up on a pedestal. So one of the things you've also, and I'm going to take this to the macro view for a moment, you use this metaphor of the pillars of the Colosseum are crumbling, but they don't have to.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack in there. So if I look at families in our society as the pillars, and those are holding up our society as a whole, similar to the Colosseum. And you can knock out a couple of those pillars. That's fine. But if you knock out too many, our whole society will crumble in on itself. And then we'll have more and more issues. If you see there's some trust issues now going, I mean, historically in our society, our families were the ones who would do a lot of the training of the children. When I was younger, my brother had some issues with the cops. Well, my dad shows up at the court. Hey, I'll take care of this. And so he gets a lighter sentence because he knows that there's going to be someone who's going to follow up with him and going to keep him on the right track. But if you look at it now, we've kind of outsourced some of those people or some of those jobs. Now, if you don't have a dad, if you grow up in a single parent household, often it can be difficult to get that discipline and support. And then the cops are kind of acting as your dad, right?
Or the school system.
The school system, but you don't have that
curriculum.
100%. You don't have that same love that you would get from a father who's like, man, you screwed up, but I'm going to try to help you do better. And therefore, even if you stole, okay, I'll go, give the money back. We'll go deal with the stealing, and then I'll help train you against that. But if you don't have that training, then you start to go into theft, and then the cops are picking you up, and the cops, they're not there to love you.
Yeah, I think it's called something like Padres, Pedro's Padres. Its father is the state, something the Latin. Yeah. And I think one of the things your book also talked about is when you were growing up, you had chores. You had to know how to sew and cook and vacuum and clean the bathroom and all these unfun things. But what it did was it taught you both a work ethic, but it also taught you the process. And I know one of the things you talked about in your book was your mother grew up on a farm. So she said, to do it thoroughly.
Yeah. Yes, she is definitely the one who taught me, here's how you do the job. and then here's how you do the job right. And the job is not done until it's done right. So a lot of that, when you get into, you go to school, like that was, I mean, that's our culture, right? Because in a farming community, if you don't do the job right, hey, I'm going to go sow my seeds. My grandpa was a potato farmer, right? And also raised some sheep. If you don't go do it right, you don't harvest, right? There's this real consequence to poor work and then you being able to survive. So there's kind of an element of doing things the correct way because your life depended on it. And I think we've kind of got to a little sloppier place. You know, there's very little that our children now have. They now have the opportunity to do, right? And there's a book, Escaping the Endless Adolescence, that they talked about this specifically. We've kind of given our kids no jobs that matter in society. Here's a paper that I want you to write that no one really wants to read. Here's math equations that we want you to solve that no one really cares about because we've solved them all. So there's a lot of kids are kind of suffering from a lack of purpose because they look around and go, if I disappeared, my family would just be richer, right? They would have more money.
Right. And I want to get into where I think the next generation can step up, and that this kind of comes from some of my training in the luxury world. But let me go back for a moment to you talked about culture, business, family, and structure. And I know that those are kind of some of the themes of your book, which if you could hold up for a moment, that would be lovely. I know it might feel a little cheesy, but do you have your book next to you?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. And I did buy it. And so it's a lovely book, and it's very much worth reading, because one of the things that we have set an intention of in this conversation is expanding that legacy dialogue to include the emotional and social side. And one of the things you mentioned is, as much as you appreciated the books by Robert Kiyosaki, there were some blind spots in there of how much do you push yourself to invest? You know, whether someone's in the middle class, the upper middle class, if they're affluent, because at what cost then on the other side does it have on the children or on the social relationship? So would you speak into this?
On that? Well, so let's talk a little bit about, like you talked about, the structure, the strategy, and the culture. If you look at any company, all companies have a strategy, structure, and culture. Google, you know, their strategy is organize the world's data. Their structure is we have very low levels of management, and then their culture is a lot of freedom and responsibility. Go explore things. If you compared that to Walmart, their strategy is provide low-cost goods to families so we can all live better. Their structure is very hierarchical because they have a lot of people that are not very well trained. They hire people just out of school. Sometimes they're even in high school still. And then their culture is one of conformance, following directions, following orders. Now, both of those companies are producing billions of dollars of revenue per year and providing lots of value in our society, but they have very different strategies, structures, and cultures. And if you were to try to take the culture of Google and put it in Walmart, it would be a failure. And if you try to take those across the board, so there's not a right business model in the business sense, but the same is true in families, right? So you need to have the business model for your family in alignment, that it's agreeing. If you want to be a doctor and yet you don't have this cultural value of delayed gratification, this is a 10-year commitment with lots of money and lots of effort. At some point, if you don't have that value, you're going to get off the train and probably be in more debt without the job at the end of the rainbow. So that business model is really the thing in a company that's making the decisions on how to utilize the resources. Should Google spend $1 million on a Super Bowl ad to build up its social resources, right? That's just not money. They're trying to get money long term, but that's a class of things that I think we don't consider in our families: our social connections, our relationships, the groups we're involved with, and our reputation, right? So if you look at in a family, those social connections can be very important, because if you don't have good social connections as a human being, you have mental health issues, which then that's hitting your human resources. You know, your time you can't use as well, because now you're dealing with mental health issues, you're dealing with bad thoughts, you're just not as focused on work. So there's the human resources, which I call your abilities, your time, and your health. And you kind of need to look at this. All companies holistically invest, right? Google doesn't just say, we're just going to get money, we're maximizing that. They're like, we're going to hire people to increase our human resources. Then we're going to spend on our brand to build our social resources. Then we're putting out this product, and hey, now we're making more money here. So we're getting financial resources. But the business model is holistically looking at all three classes of those resources. And if in our families we neglect that, we say, hey, financial, I'm just going to focus, I'm going to work and my wife's going to work. okay, what's your connection going to be between you and your spouse? Are you neglecting that social connection, which is the most important? Because if that social connection breaks down between you and your spouse, you'll have a divorce, which is a dissolution of your company. And if everyone who knows about divorce, it destroys massive amount of wealth because you're often selling assets at wrong times. You all of a sudden have all these bad feelings and bad relationships. So your social resources are getting destroyed. Your human resources are getting destroyed because your health is no longer as supported. You're not around people as much, and your financial. So you're literally destroying so many resources by getting that divorce. Sometimes it's definitely a necessary piece because you're really going in different directions. But so often it's just, we got divorced because we were only focused for financial returns. We weren't investing in social relationships.
Or learning one another's love languages. Absolutely. One of the things that you spoke about in our preamble was, there might not be a KPI, a key performance indicator, to quantify social resources, social capital, the way that Nike might have a line on their spreadsheet regarding goodwill for their brand. And so we know that it's valuable. And yet, like we had spoken about, so often the priority is just on the money. And one of the big secrets in the room when it comes to affluent, ultra high net worth families is if they do it right, it's great. But if they don't do it right, the big secret is oftentimes their children hate the parents because the parent is more focused on the business, and the business is the golden child. And they think, oh, the parents love that business so much.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're competing with that business. Yeah.
Yeah. For love, which is a basic human need. And all children need that. And, their spouse needs that. And that's really where, my wife and I have actually run an Irish dance business for 20 years together. And she did dance her whole life. I did partner dance my life, a lot of those things, but it was mainly so I could, for dating purposes and those things. But when we came together, she had the skill set to teach, and I had the skill set to take care of all the logistics. I shovel the snow all the time. I do the technology. So all those things, that's my piece. And then she takes care of her piece, and the business works out well. And we've actually been able to pull our children into the business, which I think is phenomenal, because how do our children learn? But by watching us. So as soon as they come in to the business and they watch how my wife interacts and they watch how I interact, they can learn that business model. And that's the interesting piece with wealthy individuals. The business model is the engine that generated the wealth, right? If someone says, I want to be rich, cool. You can give them money. And you see this with lottery winners. There's a story in the book. I talk about this woman, her dad died at 20, or her dad died when she was 18, and she got $20 million. And she didn't know what to do with it. Now she's on her fourth marriage. She's trying to get buy and sell businesses, but she doesn't know what to do with it. So she's kind of has this really rocky life because she got all the resources without the business model.
Or and without the guidance and the training.
Yeah. Well, and that's the business model. How do I make decisions? How do I think about it? All very wealthy people that I've been around, they tend to be very giving, and they tend to want to help people who are motivated. But there's this place where they have to be very conscientious about how they spend their time because they have so little of it because so many people want it. So often it's the family that's getting neglected. And
Sure. And there was also a story in your book that I thought was worth highlighting in our podcast conversation right now, which is you wanted to cut down some trees in your front yard, and instead of paying, $4,000 or $5,000, you reached out to your church community. And some family members, some brothers, they brought their children, they brought their tools, their chainsaws, their wood chippers, and it became a big community group project. And then all of the wood that was chopped up then could be a free resource for people to come by and take. I thought maybe you could speak into the story, because there was a decision point, a fork in the road of where you could have either chosen to spend $4,000 or $5,000 or leaned into your social capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the cases. Well, some of it's leaning into the social capital, but there's also a different side that I want to take on that too, because I did have the money. It wasn't a question of, hey, do I have $4,000 or $5,000? Yes. But then I was like, when do I have the opportunities to work? Because hard work is an important part of my business model, of my culture. How do I show my kids I work hard if every time they see it, oh, you hired someone to come do the work for you? So it was a culturally reinforcing activity.
You threw money at the problem.
Yeah, I throw money. And then what do kids learn? Oh, that's my way to solve problems. I get money, I throw it. And then a lot of times I get money from my dad or my mom, and then I throw it at a problem and it goes away. So I looked at it and I said, I have the money. It's going to cause me to reduce my social resource or my financial resources, but I also am missing an opportunity to build social resources, right? Because the church, I didn't actually reach out to the church. Frankly, I reached out to my brother to start out with. And my brother was like, we did it. We actually dropped a tree on the house, which was fun, bent the rain gutter. And it was just a lot of work to take down trees because I think we had 2 adults and like 3 or 4 kids. And then I had a guy from my church was just driving by, and then he's like, hey, what's going on? And I'm like, well, we're doing this. It's taking a long time. He's like, we could do an activity. We could do this together. Because so many men, especially that work in white collar jobs, they love to use tools. They love to work their body physically. So we went to church the next day. The guy said, hey, there's this activity. Who wants to come? And so it was funny because that Thursday, right, we were going to do it on the Saturday. The Thursday before, there was a guy who I knew very well. And then there was another guy who knocked on my door, and they were like, so we're here to look at the job. And I'm like, I don't even know you. And the guy was like, he's not even of the same church. He wasn't even a church member, but he's like, I want to be part of the community. So he showed up. He had been in Canada, knew how to cut down all these trees. So then
those Canadians,
they just know how to do it. I know, love them. And then we had, I think, 10 guys show up with their sons with chainsaws. It was like chocolate milk and donuts is what we provided. A guy went and borrowed a rock chipper, an industrial sized rock chipper. He ran it for most of the day, and we took care of the whole project. And it actually built our relationships because now my social connections got stronger from that. So instead of being a reduction in my financial resources, I actually had an increase in my social resources. And interestingly enough, that one of the guys who was part of that ended up he had a company and ended up getting hired, and it was exceptionally well for me financially. So you look at this, like, how are you investing in social connections and how are you doing it? It seems counterproductive because a lot of times people don't want to ask for help, but asking for help and serving other people is actually the number one way to build social connections. I mean, one other example I think illustrates this really well. When I got married, my mom, there was like 400 people at my wedding. And I was going, who are you? This is my wedding, my wife. Neither one of us know you. What the freak are you doing here? This is about me. And then they would say, well, your mom, she helped my son get his Eagle Scout. Your mom, she helped us when we had some illnesses. Your mom, she helped us with this problem. I'm like, oh, you're not here for me. You're here for her. But they would ask me, hey, what are you doing with your career? How can we help you? She was essentially, she had built up all these social resources through her service in the community that then she was leveraging for me, presence, right? Social connections to get jobs, everything. And that is the place where people are not understanding the value of social connections just in terms of resources. But if you do not have strong social connections, you'll also find you have mental health problems. We as humans are not designed to be alone.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you also mentioned in our preamble was the idea of compromising if somebody has their focus just solely on the financial resources. And again, you had spoken about, like, you had wanted to take the path that Robert Kiyosaki had left, in terms of the breadcrumbs. And yet, would you like to?
Yeah, I can talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I thought it was just so real. And it's the behind the scenes. Like, I bought his book. It was amazing. But let me tell you, in real life, what it was like.
Yes. So to be clear, I love Kiyosaki's work. I have his game Cash Flow. It is my favorite game to play because it is the game that made the light bulb go on for me to understand how money works and flows. And also to understand my goal with money was not to be rich. My goal was financial freedom. So I loved his work. And as I started to go through that, at one point we had our business. I'd moved into my house and there was this opportunity to do some real estate investing. And I jumped in 2007, perfect time to do it, right? Got in, was building a property, and then 2008, the housing market dropped. So instead of being a $50,000, $60,000 gain, I ended up with $250,000 in debt. And it weighed on me so hard. As a father, I had 4 children, and I thought I'd potentially compromise my mortgage, my home. I'm like, I could lose my house if because of some of the risks I take. What was I doing? So I didn't take into account the mental health side of it for me personally. Now, luckily, my wife didn't say, "You're an idiot, I'm going to leave you now." She said, "We'll get through this together." And then my parents also came and talked to me because I was not in a good space when you make decisions like that. But I had the social resources to support me through it. And then my wife and I, in the next 6 or 7 years, paid off all of our debt. We were both like, we don't like this feeling. We want to be able to take risks. We want to be able to have more freedom. We need to pay off all our debt. And every financial advisor will say, that's so stupid. It's low interest. Don't pay off your debt. You should just take out loans and then leave those loans and go into the stock market. I agree if you're only focused on the financial returns, but I can't tell you the mental load that it took off of me personally when all of my debt was paid off. I was no longer, I could lose my house, I could do these type of things. It was now mentally and emotionally, my wife and I had come together on that, and I felt much more secure for my family. So that's the place where I don't want to, hurt on Kiyosaki because I love his work. It's really just expanding it to include these social connections and these human resources in the equation as you're making decisions.
Absolutely. And understanding the compromise that if you do one, where are the ripple effects with the other areas in one's life? So,
Mm-hmm.
so let me talk about the remedy for a moment. So throughout your book, you mentioned this flywheel concept that includes cooperation, roles, and responsibility. So how does this build out the family unit well?
Okay. Well, yeah, if you know the book Good to Great, that's where this flywheel concept was kind of taken, as well as my engineering degree. So a flywheel is something that it gets going, it starts spinning, and then it's hard to slow down, right? And so you see this with the idea of compound interest is very much that in the financial sense, right? You get money, then you make more money off the money, then you make more money off the money. And over time, if you do it for long enough, you have more money than you need. Well, the same thing applies in social. If you have good friends that are doing good business deals, you're going to get pulled into business deals. You're going to get pulled in what they're learning. The number of friends that I have, oh, what book are you reading now? I'm reading this. Oh, have you thought about this? So they'll pull you into those things. So this is where you get the flywheel effect. And that's why I have that circular picture on my book, is it's really going through the circle, just like Kiyosaki did with money, but expansive. If you take your money and then you invest in going to college, great. Now you've built up those human resources. Now you're going to take those human resources in your time and now you're going to go to a job. Now you have money. Now you're going to take that and now you're going to invest, spend time trying to build a relationship, getting married. Great. Now you have another person. Now, when you get into a family, if you're specializing, like my wife and I, our Irish dance business grew from about 50 to over 220, I think, at one time, because we were specialized. Right? We weren't trying to be in this 50-50 relationship, which seems very common. If you went into a business and said, I'll give 50%, they would be like, okay, you're not hired. But a lot of times we seem to do this in relationships, like, I'm going to give 50%. What are you talking about? The marketing team doesn't say to the sales team or the product team, I'm only going to give 50%. You need to do your part. It's like, we're both going to work 100%. We're going to do different jobs. We're going to specialize differently. And that specialization is going to bring a synergy that would be impossible the other way, right? You don't want your marketing people to be like, hey, marketing, you need to go learn how to do development. Go spend the next year doing development. Why? And so in the families, we seem to, for some reason, have tried to push that, like everyone needs to do it. And coming from my own experience, my wife has been doing the dance, St. Patrick's Day, whenever that comes around, we always have so many events. It's a busy time. And there's points when she normally is in charge of shopping, getting the food ready. She loves taking care of the health of the family. But in those cases, she goes, oh, I need your help. Can you go do the shopping? Can you make some of the meals? Can you do these type of things? So I'm in this 100%. And it's not a matter of that's your job or that's not my job. It's we're in a business and we're both trying to do this together. And if we focus on it, doing it together in these shared long-term visions and goals, we'll get there and we'll have a much more exciting life and successful life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know one of the questions that your book asks the reader is to sit down, whether they're in a relationship, a family unit, whatever their scenario is, if they're dating, so forth, and to write out a mission statement.
Well, that's a very key part. If you've ever worked at a company, I worked at Ancestry.com, and the mission was to connect people across distance and time. That's a compelling statement where people can go, yeah, that is an important thing we should be doing in our society. And if you look at when businesses get started, you often are like, what business are we going to get into? If you and I wanted to start a business and I said, I want to do a legal business, and you say, I want to do an accounting business, we probably shouldn't get together. So it's really like, what is our shared mission? Why did we get together? Was it a lot of people? I think it's, well, we got together because she was hot or he was cool.
Or yeah, absolutely. And I can agree with you what you had mentioned before. I think one of the dangers, if somebody shows up and they're only giving 50% or worse, there's something Tony Robbins talks about where people just show up to take and they forget to give. And I think that's another, it's a reactionary behavior. But if somebody doesn't increase their awareness and consciousness around it, then they don't realize that they're showing up and they're just taking and taking. But yeah, I ask all my clients to write out a mission statement and a vision statement, so I can appreciate that your book is also asking the reader to do the same, because I don't think a legacy is so far out of reach. A legacy doesn't just have to be for certain families. It can be for anybody that's got a dream and a heart that's in the right place regarding personal agency. And like you had spoken about before, there are going to be times and tragedies and trials in your life, but you can't just fall back into thinking that you're a victim. And I think a part of writing out a mission statement with goals, where you talked about going from the vague to the very specific, it is a proactive step to understand, why are we showing up? And gosh, you give somebody a reason why and go down even 7 layers as to that why, it will change how they show up, and it'll change, their presence of why it matters and the meaning. And I think today more than ever, people need meaning in their life.
Yeah, I think we're definitely having a crisis of meaning and a crisis of purpose. And that's where I think as families and even as individuals, I've had a lot of people tell me I should build a dating app from the book concepts, because they're like, it's much more like trying to find founders. Do you have a complementary skill set? Because that's really what you're looking for in a spouse, is how do we complement each other?
You're talking about partnership.
Yeah. How do you have a partnership? And that's a big challenge that people, if you don't grow up in a family with 2 parents, which none of their fault, it's just the circumstances, but it's that you kind of need to recognize, I don't know how to treat a partner. I don't know how this partnership is done. I need to research it, understand it, because there's a lot of negotiation and compromise. I don't know how it is with you, but you're constantly like, where's our values? What are we doing? What's important now? And
well, there's a lot of give and take. And one of the things that you had mentioned in our preamble, it's sometimes young men these days, they don't know what to do, because if reality television has talked about the bling bling, where has the examples been of how to successfully navigate those negotiations? Yeah, without devaluing the other person or the man to feel emasculated.
Well, yeah, and there's another thing that's very different that's changed. I got married when I was 21. My wife was 23, right? I was still in school. She was just almost finishing school. We were and I think I spent my last $2,000 on her. I had no resources. When we came together, it was like a startup. No one had any resources. We had our family relationships. We had our skills and stuff, but it wasn't this big thing. I see now when people are delaying it until, late 20s, even sometimes into their 30s and 40s, it becomes now you have all these resources. You have a full business model as you as an individual. What is your strategy? What's your culture? I hang out with the guys and we do these activities, and then I ride my bike and I do all these things and I have all these structures in place. So they already have 2 separate business models. And then when you have people getting married in those times, it's like having a merger, right? It's not just the simple marriage like I did, like, okay, 50-50. I have a friend who's in his 40s and he's financially secure where he's like, I could retire today, but he has no family. And then he's like, he's having a hard time. Well, if I bring this woman into my relationship, we get married, she has access to all my resources. How do we make this work?
It could be a liability.
That's the thing that I don't think people consider is, if you don't build it together. My wife and I have built all of our things together. We made all of these choices together. We did all the compromising. And so it's not like, oh, I did this and I was successful over in the business and you were successful over in your Irish dance. No, we collectively did this. We collectively stayed together. And that builds massive trust in each other, right? We've gone through hell in a lot of ways. There's different places. I got audited by the IRS at one point. It was not a fun experience, but it's like, I've been through these difficult things with my wife. I trust her that she will be there. And how else could I have gone through that without doing it? and without going through those experiences. And I think a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to get married till I'm financially secure, and I don't want to do this. Men are spending, I think the average was men spend about $20,000 a year on women when they're single, trying to get them, date them, doing all these things. So all that money is just getting pushed into the ether. But if you were married, then you would actually have it towards your business. So that's the type of stuff that I think you're looking at. Like merging a company, if anyone who knows about mergers, is like 50% plus failure is common. Often they don't add value. Often they destroy value. I think it's the same. It's hard to merge companies. It's hard to merge families, but it can be done. It just has to be very intentional.
Absolutely. And it might not always be pretty. Like you said, you were young, 21, she was 23. It wasn't the shiny Mercedes in the driveway. It was, we're going to get our hands dirty, and we're going to have some sweat equity, and we're going to make this work and create something that's beautiful. And I can understand what you're saying, that sometimes people want to wait till it's perfect, or they want to wait until it's a finished product, so they don't have to worry about the things that are just going to happen. And again, that's where people are going to get their hands dirty. The IRS might show up. It might be, and I appreciate that you spoke into some of those heartache moments, because that is real life, and we don't really get to skimp out on it, even if we're going to try and insure our way out of, those heartaches. And I think it does thicken someone's skin. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's, again, I go back to this concept of social resources. How do you have a relationship with someone who you've not gone through anything with? Do you know what I mean? When you first meet someone on a date for the first time, or just meet anyone in general, you're not like, oh, I have this relationship and I trust you, because I don't know you. I don't know how you're going to respond in hard situations. I don't know what's going to happen. As you go through life with someone, then you know that. You see that. And that's where the relationship is built. So in some ways, you're neglecting that social investing in the relationship, because you're trying to go through all these hard things on your own. And we all know, from at least my experience, you start on those low-level jobs. I mean, I had jobs where I was cleaning toilets and washing dishes, right? But it was aligned with my mission of going to college, doing these other things. I was happy doing it, right? And then as I went through it, I'm like, I can do anything, because I've done everything. I've done crappy sales jobs, phone surveys. I've done all sorts of things, because they all went towards my goal, and I was happy with them at the time. Frustrated.
Yes, yeah. And at the height of 6'4", you gave up an opportunity to possibly play for the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, it was more like, I look at it in retrospect. I was in high school, and then I was like, I'm 6'4". I have a big body. I could do this. But then I kind of realized, what am I giving up? I mean, there's always trade-offs. And I look at some of the NFL people. I'm a big fan of the Chiefs. I just love, Andy Reid, he's a great coach. And then you had Travis Kelce, who's their tight end. I think he's 240, I think he's 250 and 6'4". And I'm like, that's the same size.
This is American football, by the way, to the international listeners. Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
But yeah, so he's like, he has very similar. And I just look back and I'm like, man, I could have focused on that. But that's a totally different lifestyle. If you can get traded from your team, you're constantly playing every Sunday. Is that the lifestyle that I wanted? Right? I could have made money there, potentially. I wasn't God's gift to football, but I just looked at the numbers going, is this how I'm going to make my life work? And so there was a point in high school where I was just like, yeah, I'm going to go and bail on this. I'm going to focus on engineering. I was taking all these advanced classes in mathematics and sciences. My dad had been a professor and done those things. So I was like, he knows. I had his business model. Go get a white collar profession. So then I could do that. It would be interesting if I had a professional football player as my dad, probably would have been pushed that way. Sure. So that's kind of where, because I would have seen that business model. I would have known what it was, and I would have had support getting there. As it was, I went and got my degrees, did fine. Everyone struggles in college occasionally. Engineering is not a joke, but the thing I do love about engineering, and it kind of bleeds into the book. In engineering, you have to learn. I did mechanical engineering, so it's how do you can build airplanes as a mechanical engineer. So you have to understand all these dynamics of the plane, the lift, the thrust, and keeping all these variables. There's always trade-offs. If I want more thrust, that's going to take more weight. If I want more weight means I have to have bigger wings. So once you understand the principles, you can build this agile fighter jet, or you can make a giant, Boeing 777. And that's the same thing I want people to see in the book. I'm not trying to be prescriptive, but I'm trying to give you the principles that govern all families, right? You can't get away from them, all businesses and families. So once you understand them, then you have the ability to look broadly. What do I want to build? Am I trying to build this agile fighter jet family or this big plane, big passenger plane? Because everyone wants different things out of life.
Absolutely. So as you dip into the intangibles, things like social capital and human capital, let me bring up leadership for a moment. You said in your book that every leader needs to know how to be a good follower. But my question to you is, what about the leaders that have big egos?
Well, usually those people have a lot of trouble getting followers, right? They have a lot of trouble. And when I've seen them with the big egos, a lot of people don't want to work for them. I mean, I've heard people talk very negatively about Steve Jobs and how he did certain things, but I've also heard people who worked for him and they were like, no, he was so focused on the customer. It wasn't, I'm Steve Jobs, do it my way. I have the big brain, you have to do it. It was much more, we're trying to deliver this for the customer. So again, I think it comes back to focusing on what is your mission and goals. And if you have leaders with big egos that are not doing things correctly or not getting the right contributions from their followers, then what you often see is the talent leaves them. And I think the same thing happens in a family, right? If you're not a good leader, hey, either way, your wife or husband would be like, screw this, I'm out. You're kind of a jerk.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to highlight that question for a moment because I think sometimes people can say, well, I earn more, therefore you need to follow my lead. And how well does that play out, whether it's the male that's the breadwinner, the female that's the breadwinner, or any type of dynamics, these days regarding the family unit. And if that one party says, well, or that one person says, well, I am the bigger breadwinner, then that makes for interesting dynamics in keeping a functional family unit.
Oh, 100%. I think one thing that's interesting to consider is, I think for a lot of men, for whatever reason, we associate if we run out of money, then we're probably going to run out of wife, right? Like if you go broke, then your wife may be like, I'm out. Like, what are you here for? What are you providing? And I think a lot of women often will be, I've seen it where they're like, they spend a lot of money on their looks and on those type of things because they feel kind of similar. If I run out of looks, then my husband won't be attracted to me and then he'll go cheat on me. So there's often this dynamic where women are trying to spend money on themselves to remain attractive to their husband, but the cost of spending the money is the guy's like, but if I lose all my money, then how are we going to do this? So there's often
I'm sorry to interrupt. There's an expression in Los Angeles, and the expression is there ain't no romance without the finance.
Well, and you look at it, I mean, it's an interesting thing because I have my daughter, she's finished her nursing degree. And then I was like, well, who do I want her to marry? I'm not saying go find a homeless guy who has bad values. I'm like, look at his culture, look at his family, look at their values, find where it's a match. How much money is he going to make? How productive is he? How is he going to contribute? So there's a side where for my daughters, I want them to have a productive husband because if they want to have families, they need a productive husband, especially during the pregnancy and depending on how many children you want, right? So the women need resources to support them through those times quite often. And then vice versa, if you look at men, a lot of times the men will be like, people will be like, oh, men just want hot girls. But if you look at it, and there's a chapter I talk about this, attractive women are attractive because they're able to have children. There's a lot of biological stuff, symmetry in the face. If you look at what men tend to be attracted to, it's fat in all the right places, right? So it's this weird side of, we sometimes will get mad at the other sex for that, but it's really just a factor of, when I've come down to it, like, oh yeah, I understand why this is happening at a biological level. This is not just something I can complain about.
Sure. So what are some great family cultures that you think are worth paying attention to?
Well, when I say this is the place where it's a little complicated because it's more about alignment, right? I went to Mexico on a vacation. We went into the jungle with my children. It was more of a learning vacation where this family was living like they'd lived for 500 years, or thousands of years. The husband would be the farmer, grow the corn. The wife would make the tortillas. They had beans. And then that's just how they lived. So that culture, it was much more about learning from your parents and following in their example. That's the best chance of survival you have. Whereas in my family, my dad was a white collar worker. He learned technology, was an early programmer. So his culture, our culture in the US largely needs to be, are you a quick learner? Are you good at implementing stuff once you've learned it? That's what I'd call the technologist, right? And then you'd have like a blue collar person. If they're going in that field, it's much more about, can you do the hard things regardless of the weather? You know, can you make yourself do them? Do you have that discipline?
And the
Because if you
staying
don't,
power
and the
compared to the
staying power, because
execution
you'll,
and application.
so when you look at culture, again, I don't like to say there's one specifically right one, just like Walmart and Google, the cultures that I think have been effective. If you're going to be in the white collar professions, technology, you need to have learning as an important part of that culture. You need to be reading books, reading blogs, listening to podcasts, those type of things, because your livelihood's dependent on it, right? If you're going to be a bricklayer or one of those, then you need to probably spend more time on relaxation, keeping your body in good shape, because that's really the primary resource, not your brain. So it's much more around aligning and creating that culture with your business model as a whole versus just saying, I need to be a heavy learner, but I live in, you know, I've actually thought a lot of times when we try to go build schools in Mexico, hey, we're going to go build this school. Why do I need calculus? Why do I need math? This is incongruent with the business models that are actually effective here.
Absolutely. And so I appreciate that you're speaking into these nuances, because I think these nuances are sometimes in the back of somebody's mind, you know, whether it's that dating scene, whether it's how do I make income and keep income. There's so many different dimensions. So I appreciate again that you're speaking into these nuances, because it's not just sometimes from point A to point B and then boom, we've got success. There's so much more to the depth of life and the quality of life that that are such huge blind spots. And if we're not going to come across this on the mainstream media or the evening news, how do we know how to navigate these waters? So let me get to one of the other problems that your book addresses, which is the next generations might not be fully ready, whether it's for a successful marriage partnership, that family unit, or even accepting a large inheritance, because there's missing skill sets. And you referred to this metaphor of like a McDonald's franchise. If somebody is about ready to be given that huge McDonald's building and the business, and it's, let's say it earns, whether it's $1 to $10 million a year, but if they don't know the manual, the user's manual for how to make that work, it's like the young lady you mentioned that received that inheritance when she was 20 years old. And you know, a decade or two later, it was just too much for her. And I even sometimes look at somebody like Britney Spears and I think to myself, I don't know if stardom was the right choice for her in her lifetime. She might have just been better off if she had just lived, you know, in Louisiana and not had to deal with the mountains of pressure and all the complexity. So I know this is kind of a big question, but where do we start in the culture of the family or in general?
Well, yeah, and if you start with the culture, then I would say, are you spending time with your kids, and do your kids see you working? Whatever that is, right? If that's historically, you know, you'd be a farmer and then your kids would come work with you and they would see you work day in and day out.
Okay, I just want to interrupt on one quick point. You had said so that children can see the parents working, and I agree. I think they need to see their parents sweating, and I don't mean sweat in the physical sense. I mean like they get that piece of bad news that some shipment of supplies in their family business or whatever it is did not arrive. And that supplier in that other country can't deliver that product because it's no longer sustainable. And to see that parents sweat that moment of, oh my goodness, I have to deal with this headache, and watching them navigate through that headache. Because if all they see is that parent come home at the end of the day, whether that's 5 o'clock or 10 p.m. at night, and they don't get to see the whole meltdown, the breakdown for the breakthrough, then they miss out on seeing again that sometimes life is rosy and other times it's not. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's, you want to have the kids see what work looks like. And I think a lot of kids now, especially with white collar work, you know, the parent goes to work, the parent comes home, they're tired, sits down, watches TV, does something else. And the kids are like, oh, I guess that's what you do as an adult. You sit on your butt and relax. But they missed out on the 8 hours of work and they have no idea actually what that looks like. And so I think it's about, and if you have small businesses, I did this with my Irish dance business, we would pull in our children and have them help us with certain things. And we've had all of our children help teach over the years, because you're trying to show like, here's the value system. So one of it's spending time, if possible, working and showing your kids how you work. Another thing is doing activities that reinforce the core values of your business. If learning is an important part of your business, then you should probably be reading with your kids. Like read to them different things, read different books. If overcoming hard things and dealing with difficult situations is a core part of your business, of your culture, then you might want to do activities like skiing. And I did scuba diving with my kids, where it's like, there are consequences here. And especially with skiing, you start out with like, oh, I'm on this flat surface and I feel out of control. But then you gradually like, oh, I see this pattern. I do it, I fail, I then get back up, then
And
I
I can
get more
trust
success,
myself.
and I can trust myself. And that's the thing, a lot of people will say, just be confident. But you don't want people, if I took you skiing and it was your first time and you're like, I'm confident I can do the hardest run, you're just going to wreck yourself, right? Confidence is earned through this pattern. It's not just like, it's not a thing you just get. So there's places where you trust yourself intellectually, like, yeah, I've had these type of problems. Oh, now what do? I go research, I talk to people, I find a solution, I go implement the solution, I solve it. They're seeing that pattern and that cycle, and that's the important thing.
Absolutely. And I just want to add to that when somebody says just go out there and be confident, they don't realize that it takes a life experiences to build that confidence. It's not just, there's this expression that irritates the heck out of me called fake it till you make it. You cannot fake it until you make it, because it is not real confidence. The confidence comes because what's behind every single corner. The 10,000 clues of what is called time in. But if you don't have that time in, then it's not real confidence. It's like, I don't know, gravy over ice cream or something. I know that's not the best metaphor, right? It irritates. And then the other expression, sometimes they say to people, well, if you build it, they will come. Part of that's true. You do have to show up, and 51% of success is showing up. But really, you got to build it the right way. But to know what's the right way is that that time in of making 1,000 mistakes and failing and looking bad, even if you know that other people are watching and they're judging. It's like you still show up anyways. Yeah. So, okay.
Well, and that goes back to this. Like I said, Robert Kiyosaki stuff was super important. So I had my kids play his games. I've had them read them. I've had them discuss it. Right. So it's really looking at your culture and looking what you think were the core elements of your learnings and trying to pass that on to your children through activities. Like I say, some of it's skiing. Scuba diving I liked because, a lot of the rules in school are frankly kind of arbitrary. In scuba diving, they're less arbitrary. Don't do this or you die, right? So you kind of get into the real world and you're trying to help your kids realize there are real consequences for things, and how do they learn that, and then how do they deal with problems? So that to me is you're trying to teach your kids how you think and how you would approach problems. And that's through the culture. That's also through your structure and how you treat your spouse, right? So much is around your teaching is your example. Kids are great at absorbing.
Yeah, they're witnessing.
Yep.
Can I get a witness? Okay. So and I want to circle back to something you had mentioned in the beginning, and then we'll wrap. You had mentioned the book about escaping the endless adolescence. So if I were to opine that I think these days the skill sets that young adults can step into, and adults of all ages, children as well, is in the areas of relationship building, emotional intelligence, those softer skills, morality and values, even just being a positive mirror for another in holding that space of encouragement. What say you?
Yeah, I agree that there's a lot of opportunity in the skills, and it's giving the kids the opportunities to use those skills, right? I've seen so much where we're like, our school system's like, hey, we're going to teach kids about financial intelligence, but then we're not going to actually give them opportunities to use it. We're going to teach them about social intelligence or social skills, but we're not going to really give them opportunities to use it. That's where parents have been so useful in the end. They teach, and then, okay, let's try to teach my kids social skills. Now let's go try to go to a restaurant and see how that goes. It's annoying sometimes and they cry. So it's really, how are you teaching those skills, and how are you giving them opportunities? But I honestly think with most of our teenagers, they need to get that purpose, right? As soon as you give them a meaning and a purpose, and that's where the book, The Escaping Adolescence, talked about specifically, these kids, if you give them something that's meaningful, all of a sudden they will get the confidence. They'll start to think about problems. I mean, my daughter went and started working at this warehouse at one point, And she was like, now all of a sudden, all the questions she had were around operations. And she's like, Dad, how does this work? Dad, all those questions were because she was working and I had studied operations so I could teach it to her. But if she hadn't had that meaningful thing that she was trying to impact, then she wouldn't have she wouldn't have any reason to talk to me. And we wouldn't have been able to build that relationship. So I think it's this thing of giving kids the skills, teaching them. And there is a skill. I mean, you're fake it till you make it. I would say it can be bubbled down, in my opinion. Like, you have to have some faith. Like,
Well,
you're not going to
absolutely.
know everything. It's like, you have to take the first step, but you can't act like you know everything, because then you're not humble. You want to be in this, I'm taking action, but I'm also trying to learn and understanding that I don't know. And that's one place what I see with a lot of people. If you come from a home that you don't think was a very effective family, you need to kind of understand this was not a good business model. There's things that I look at from my parents and from my in-laws. I'm like, they did some really good things and they did some really dumb things. So I want to look at that and pull that out and to make my culture and my values so that I can make a better set of stuff to transfer to my children.
Absolutely, in your family's business model and family culture. And I just want to share one quick story before I ask you about your own personal legacy. And I think you had mentioned it was a young man who was playing video games for 3 or 4 hours, and then he had the opportunity to lift and bale hay. And he was willing to do it in exchange for the reward of a burrito. But it was, and maybe it's a male thing of that physical labor, but he got out there, this young man, and he was willing to take care of the hay. And it wasn't glamorous, and it's hard work.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was one psychologist I was listening to. I can't remember his name off the top, but he said men actually bond in the presence of stress. Like, men love to go fight each other, even football, baseball, all these things. So they want that stress. And he wanted the connection, even though there's the video game. When it was my son, actually, and he got a call from a friend like, hey, can you come help us? She's like, sure, for 8 hours or something. I'm like, what are you doing? But they had such a good relationship because of that. And that's where you see, like, men need these things, a purpose to come together quite often. And this guy actually interestingly said, women often in our current independent, I'm an independent babe, I got all my stuff
I'm
taken
strong
care
and
of,
independent.
I'm strong
I'm a
and independent.
feminist.
And this guy was saying, but women, when they ask men to help, that's when men bond to the women, because they're like, oh, I can be useful here. And so often women are like, I'm independent. They're missing out on the opportunity to have men bond to them.
Or feel
And I was like,
needed.
and feel needed. Yes, this is
Yeah.
a core value of most men. Like, I need to feel needed. And so if you have these scenarios where it's like, I'm not needed, or I don't know where I'm needed, they're like, okay, I'm going to go somewhere else or do something else, occupy my time. But to your point with my son, when it's like, oh, we need you, can you come help us? Yes. Like $1 an hour, but I do think he was investing, he got some food out of it, but he also invested in that relationship. Now, if he has trouble, now if he needs help, he can call on those relationships and they'll be happy to help him as well. So I think it's this important place of social relationships are very complicated and they're hard to put numbers to. And like I said, even Nike, they put a number that says how much their brand is worth, but no one really knows. It's just a guess that they put on the balance sheet to make things work out. So that's the place where we need to invest in those resources in each other. And I think when people in our society are complaining, well, our society doesn't feel very connected, our community doesn't feel very connected, I don't feel like I have lots of friends. I'm saying, like, are you investing for social returns? Are you going to your neighbors, taking them cookies? Are you serving people around you? If you're not, well, of course you should feel disconnected. Why would you be connected to people you've done nothing for?
Yeah. Well, I think this conversation speaks to the many nuances. And again, if we don't bring up the conversation and verbalize it and give it language, it's in the back of people's minds. And yet, they wonder, but they don't know kind of how to take that next step forward to go from kind of this conceptual essence energy to making it real in their life, so they can have that network, and not just a professional network. Like you said, it needs to be a social network of support and commonality and bonding, and whether it's over hay or whatever the shared values are. So we feel connected in this world, and our legacy is not just that we wrote a check to a local library or to our alma mater, etc. So since this is a legacy podcast, and I know I need to wrap,
Yep.
what would you like your holistic legacy to be?
So my legacy, kind of with my family, obviously, I think if I if I fail with my family, then that is a big, if my kids go off and aren't contributors in society, if I'm not building future pillars of our society, then that's a failure on my part. So I look at my children as my primary legacy and concern. They're the ones I have the biggest influence over. And then as my broader legacy, I would love to have the legacy of being known as someone who helped strengthen families, who helped build up those pillars. I honestly don't feel like I have abundance mentality. The more people who are working and contributing, the better everyone's life is going to be. So the more we understand holistically how we can be successful and more connected, the better we're all going to be off. So if that could be my legacy as being one who's built families and supported them, I'd love it.
That's lovely. And what values or a single guiding principle do you get to honor through and by that holistic legacy?
I'd say the primary, one of my primary values is contribution. Like I need to contribute. If I don't feel like I'm contributing, I feel very nervous, and it's not contributing in it's just like, how can I contribute? How can I make the biggest difference? And I look at it as my abilities have risen, as my skills have risen, all those type of things. I look at it going, I need to lift the heaviest rock I can. I need to lift the heaviest obstacles, things that I can to contribute to society. Because if I'm not doing it, why would I expect anyone else to do the hard things, right? Being married, frankly, it's a struggle sometimes, right? And keeping that together, it's not always sunshine and roses. Building businesses, this whole book process is, like you're going through these things of, I need to do the heaviest things and the biggest thing that I think can make an impact in society. So I'm really guided by this. I need to contribute. I can't be a taker. I have to be a contributor.
Lovely. That's lovely. Thank you, Aaron, so much for being a guest speaker on this podcast. I know we set the intention at the very beginning to talk about how to merge the business world with the family unit, whether it's through the business modeling or through the culture. And I think that you have definitely delivered in introducing the listeners to what can be possible. I hope that you'll hold up your book right now so they can see it one more time. And I will make sure that I include a link in the show notes so that if they would like to learn more, they can purchase and invest in your book, and also learn how to put together a mission statement and a vision statement for their family or their partnership, whatever stage they are in life. So thank you so much for being a guest.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here, Angelina. Thank you.
Lovely. So if you're listening on YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you are checking us out on Apple Podcasts, please remember to rate and review. Thank you so much for listening this week and joining us. And thank you, Mr. Shelley, for speaking into your legacy.